Hey, and welcome to another episode of Linux and Code. Today we're working on a project that was actually requested. So shout out to those of you who requested it, you know who you are. But we're covering creating your own Jenkins server and building out a pipeline to do testing and automatic builds. Let's get started. So a couple of things that you need to know before we get into this. We're going to be using Jenkins and we're going to be using it with Docker. So you'll need a system that has at least Docker configured and ready to go on your system. I'm personally going to be using Docker Compose, but you could also use Docker Swarm or Kubernetes if you wanted to. You just need to make some slight modifications to your YAML files in those cases. And you could also just use the Docker run command and parameterize all of the settings that I'm going to be putting in the YAML files. So with that out of the way, let's get started. Okay, so I'm on a VM here. This is actually accessible through the internet, and it has a couple of things already set up. It has Docker installed and running, it has Docker Compose installed, and it has a user that is not root set up to run Docker Compose. That's a requirement, at least for Docker Compose. You cannot run commands as root. So I'm logged into my VPS here over SSH. So let's get started with what we actually need to do. So the first thing that I'm going to do is make a directory for all of this work, and I'm going to head into it. And I'm going to make a file for my Docker Compose stuff. And we need two services, but first we're going to specify our service version, which is version 3. And our two services is going to be HTTPS portal, which is an amazing service if you want HTTPS really quick. And we need a couple of port mappings to redirect HTTP and HTTPS traffic to our desired host. So we'll do that with 80 and 443. And we need a couple of environment properties. They're pretty simple. It's just the domain to redirect, and if you want to run locally, you can specify that you want to run in a local stage and it will self-sign a certificate instead of trying to do it through an actual DNS verification. In my case, I've set up a DNS record already to point to this VPS, so I can use an actual domain. You will need a DNS entry configured for the domain that you specify here to point to the IP of whatever VM or server or computer you're using in order for this to work. If you're doing it locally, you could also just do like jenkins.localhost, for example, and that will automatically redirect to your local system. The reason I'm not doing this all locally is because I want webhooks to work with Git, and in order for that to happen, you need to either have port mapping set up so that your host is accessible to the internet, or a server that's actually running online. Now, this name that I've specified here, this Jenkins:8080, that's the service that I'm going to define next. And that's where that name comes from. It's just an internal DNS resolver that Docker has. Now, for this image, let's go ahead and get a Firefox window pulled up so I can talk about this a little bit. You have a couple of different options for Jenkins images. You have the standard LTS, which is this very first result if you Google it, and that's normal Jenkins under Docker, and that's fine. The documentation here will pull up as well because that's a really useful resource. But what we actually want is something called Blue Ocean, because that is a newer interface that has been added to Jenkins that really simplifies creating a lot of these pipelines and making things a lot easier to work with. So this is actually the one that I'm going to use. So this is the pipeline that I want, or I'm sorry, the image that I want. That's selected. And then the version that I want is whatever their tagged version is. I don't want latest because that can have breaking changes without you knowing, so I'm going to use a tagged version. That's 1.19. And then if I need to upgrade that later, I can come in and look at whatever the version is and just update this file and it will update. But I don't want to just be tagged the latest and have it rebuild and have a breaking change that I'm not aware of. So in order for Jenkins to work with the setup that we're going for, we also need a couple of volumes. And the first one is recommended over here in this documentation for Jenkins, and that's this var/Jenkins home. And what this does for us is it actually lets us back up the data if we want to for our Jenkins server, because since it's all in a Docker container, the data store that Jenkins uses is all in the file system. So this directory is where that is stored. So you can actually get to that data and pull it off from the Docker volume itself instead of having to do something else to get into the image and pull it. This way, if you have to change host or something, you can just copy the volume and you have all of your server data. So next, because we're using Docker and we're going to try to use Docker images in our builds, we also need a Docker socket, and by default this is /var/run/docker.sock. Just kind of a weird name, I know, and it's of course the same on the host that we're mapping to. This is something that is again built into the Blue Ocean version of Jenkins. I'm not sure if it is in this LTS version of Jenkins, but it is in the Blue Ocean. So next we need a port mapping. And by default, Jenkins runs on 8080, so we'll map that. And now that's where this mapping up on our HTTPS service comes in. We're also going to map one called 50,000. And the reason for that is if you want to use any build executors that aren't on this VPS or VM or wherever you have this running, this 50,000 port is how you can use the Java home or the Java executor to bind from your host to the service. They require this port, so just be aware of that. This is the base configuration that we need. So it's pretty straightforward, but just some slight subtleties like these volumes are things that you may not be aware of. And again, this domain just needs to have an IP that resolves to that domain in a DNS entry. So let's go ahead and save this. And we can do Docker compose up, and we'll tack on the build flag just for fun. And I'm gonna get an error because I have a bad block, so I'll go ahead and get that fixed really quick. Okay, so the error here I've made is actually a really dumb one. I forgot to add the services tag up here before I define my services. Whoops. So let's save that, get out of here, and let's run this again. No declaration for the Jenkins home volume. That's fine. Again, a quick edit. Let's come down here. We'll make a volumes tag, and we'll just define it as Jenkins home. We won't provide any other information to it than that. We'll just let it assume the defaults. Now we should be able to build. It'll create a network, it'll create our volume, and it'll start putting together all of the services. You can see the HTTPS portal is generating a certificate for us, which is awesome. And we're also now building out Jenkins. Now you don't want to run this in detached mode the first time you run this, and I'll show you why here in just a second. And it's because as Jenkins is starting up, it actually is locked to a password by default, and it'll output that password in this command line prompt as it's building. So we need to watch for that and then copy that password. If we miss it, there is a directory that we can get to get it, but it's much easier if we can just pull it out of this log. So we can see we finally got our signed certificate, so that's awesome. HTTPS portal basically bundles Let's Encrypt and Nginx, and it's amazing. So here's our default Jenkins password. We want to grab that before it runs away. Just paste it somewhere else for now. You will be forced to change it to a different password, so just be aware of that, but you will need it for the initial configuration. Okay, it says our Jenkins is fully up and running, so if we did this right, we can go over here to jenkins.nathanbland.dev. And this may be caused by having a different certificate than what's on the root host. I'm not entirely sure. Let me figure this out really quick. Okay, after a lot of debugging, it turns out in my DNS provider settings, I had SSL requirements turned on to be flexible. I use Cloudflare instead of full. And what that was doing is it was trying to force the traffic to go to HTTP from Cloudflare instead of HTTPS the full way across. So I changed it to full instead of flexible. And now it's actually working correctly with the certificate. So that was a little bit ridiculous, but we're good now. So now you can see if I just come to my Jenkins server URL, I'm currently prompted to unlock Jenkins. And it gives you the path that you can get it from, which would be inside your Docker container. If you didn't copy it when it was initially setting up, I have to go get mine out of a clipboard from where I saved it. And we'll run this, and it unlocks. So now that this is done, it'll give us two setup options, either using recommended plugins or selecting everything to install ourselves. If you really know what you're doing, you can do the manual install. I'm just going to do the suggested because, especially for Blue Ocean, it adds a whole bunch of other stuff that I really want. So I'm just going to let this run through all on its own. And you can also see over here in our terminal what Jenkins is actually doing in the background. So that's kind of cool. But we can just look at the nice UI for right now. And now we're going to get a chance to create our first admin user. Now this can be whatever you want. I'm going to use admin for the purpose of this video. And I'm going to create a different password really quick. Now, this email, I'm actually going to give myself a name here. And I'm going to use my actual email for this server. It'll get torn down anyway, so that's fine. And I'm going to save it. And that is the URL that I want Jenkins to listen on. So I'll go ahead and hit save and finish. And we can hit start using Jenkins. So now we're here. This is the old Jenkins interface, and it's fine. But what we want to do is use the newer interface. And in order to do that, we need to head over to a page that can either be accessed by changing this URL or just here in the left nav bar. So you can either type /blue to head over to the new interface, or you can click over here on the left where it says open Blue Ocean. So we'll go ahead and open that up. And now we're at a very different looking interface, and it's so much easier to use. So now that we're here, we can go ahead and create a new pipeline. You have a couple of different options right out of the box, depending on what you're doing. You can use Bitbucket, Bitbucket Server, GitHub, just normal Git. I'm going to be using GitHub for this example. The steps should be very similar for other providers. You just click on the provider you want. It prompts you to create a GitHub access token. So I'm going to go ahead and click over here. I may end up blurring out parts of this depending on how much sensitive information there is. So don't worry about it if there's blocked out portions. So you just have to give it a name. This is required. And then you get to set permissions. So it should by default have the ones selected that you need. We'll find out if we need to create something differently as we go along, but we're just going to leave the default permissions for right now because as you can see, it's actually set in the scope URL that we got sent to. So it should have everything selected that it needs. So we'll hit generate token. And I'll give this token, which I will copy and paste in here and hit connect. And as this goes along, we now get to pick which one of these things we want to use. And then we get to search for a repo. I'm just going to do my personal developer site. and hit create pipeline. Now, as this starts, it'll probably have an error because it'll look for something called a Jenkins file in my project, which shouldn't exist. So as you can see, our pipeline kind of got stuck creating here. So let's go head over to the dashboard and see what's going on. Give this a nice little refresh. We got our repository here. And it says we don't have any branches that contain a Jenkins file, which is correct. We can see our branches if we had any that had a Jenkins file or pull requests, which we have nothing right now. So I'm gonna go open up that project. Let's see here. And we need to make a Jenkins file here. So this will be how we control what our pipeline is doing. So once we have our Jenkins file, give this a nice little refresh. Open it up. Okay. Now it's kind of a weird style syntax because it's not like a Java, it's not like JavaScript. It's similar in a lot of ways, but it's also different enough. So let's get started. The first thing we need is a pipeline keyword, and here we're going to define a few things. We're going to define an agent, which we'll use to run this. We'll define stages, which will be what we do during our pipeline, and we'll define something we want to do afterwards, but we're not quite there yet. So first we need to talk about the agent that we're going to use. And I said earlier we wanted to be able to use Docker, and that's true. So in my case, my repository here uses Cypress for testing. So I need to be able to use a Docker image that has those dependencies along with Node.js in order to run those tests. So I'm going to set my agent over here to be a Docker image. And in this case, I happen to know that Cypress maintains images for testing purposes pretty much exactly like this. So I'm after the one that has Chrome and Node 12. Chrome 67 is a little bit old at this point. Let's look. Chrome 76. Okay, so let's do this, because this has Node 12, which is fine, and Chrome 76. Perfect. So let's go over here, and we just paste this in as a string. So that's the Docker image we wanted to use. Now, stages. We can talk about this a little bit. Whatever you want to be broken into an individual step is going to be a stage. And that stage can also have individual steps, but they won't show up as like a separate configuration point in your pipeline. You'll see what I mean by that in a minute. So let's do a simple one first. Let's say stage, and we'll say run npm audit, just to check our dependencies. And we have to open up a new set of brackets here, and then we give it our steps. And this is an sh command in our case, and then the string that we want to be executed. I'm just going to say npm audit. And remember, we're on a Docker image here that's running Node 12. Now, because of some things that Blue Ocean does for us in the background, we can already assume that it has Git and it already has access to our source code, and it's running all of that inside this Docker image. If you weren't using Blue Ocean, you would need to either set up git config in your Jenkins job manually, or you would need to set it as a build step to pull in the freshest source. So we'll just do that as a simple stage for right now. Nothing overly complex about this. So we'll add our Jenkins file to source. push it up. Okay, let's go over to our pipeline. So we know that this doesn't think we have any pipelines. So let's head back to our top level. And still nothing. So let's say create pipeline. And we want it to recognize our own. So we actually need to force it to pull our source code again. So we'll click on the little gear tab here and head over to our main Jenkins server. And what we're actually going to do is hit this Scan Repository Now button. And you can see we get these statuses over here on our executors. And you can see now we have this checking branch development Jenkins file found, which is great. So it scheduled a build for our development branch. So we can actually hop back over to our interface and you can see we had something that failed. And the reason this is going to have failed is because our socket doesn't have the correct permissions. So we actually need to, and this is a requirement of the Docker daemon, we need to escalate our Jenkins user to root in order to use this Docker agent. I'm still looking for a workaround for this because ideally you would drop that permission immediately, but I don't have one yet, so we're going to do this for now. So let's hop back over to our terminal, and you can see here we get a failure as well, but we're actually going to stop this for a minute. And we're going to just add something to our Docker Compose file here. And we're going to set the user property. So let's just go ahead and set that. We'll come down here and say user root. And we'll start it. Okay, Jenkins is fully up and running. You can see here we also got a reload message, and now we need to sign in again. So in my case, my username is admin. Grab that password. Okay. So now we're running as root. We should theoretically have access to this. So let's just rebuild it and see what we get. I'll speed this up for you guys so you don't have to sit here through all of this. Okay, we can see we succeeded in pulling our Docker image now. So that means we're actually connecting to the Docker daemon correctly, which is exactly what we want. An important thing to note here too, your pipeline will only have to pull this Docker image the first run. It won't have to do this every time unless there's been an update to the image. So you'll have a really long first run and then it'll get much faster after that. Let's go ahead and give this a refresh. Sometimes the log gets stuck. Other times it's just taking a while to set up. Okay, great. So you can see it finished our checkout and our agent setup. That's all this first step. And then you can see our stage that we defined, this run npm audit, has a check mark by it. So if we expand this, we see it ran npm audit, found 0 vulnerabilities. Awesome. Let's add another step to our pipeline. So let's come over here and let's make another stage. And now let's run a linter. That seems like a good thing to do on your code. One thing though, we aren't going to be able to run a lint until we have the dependencies that are used to do that. So we can still build the stage. And in my case, it uses ESLint, which won't be on this Docker image by default. So let's come up here and add another stage. And we'll go ahead and pull in our dependencies. I'm going to use npm CI to pull those in, and we'll name this something more friendly though. So we're going to run npm audit. Then we're going to use the CI version of npm to pull in packages that we don't have already or that have been updated. And then we're going to run our lint command. Save that. And I also would like to add another stage in here to go ahead and run my test code. And I'll do this, but this will fail. I'll show you why. Now, for me personally, CI is a little bit differently. Because I use Cypress for my tests, I have to have my server running at the same time. So I use a command called start server and test. It's a great little npm package. It basically starts my package and then waits for a response from this host and then executes something else, which in my case is the test. So that's why I'm doing this npm run CI. Not to be confused with npm CI. Two very different things. This is basically my test equivalent. So this will fail, but that's okay. Not all of it will fail. We're adding our test stages and our lint stage. And dependencies stage. Okay. Get that pushed up, come back over here, check our branches, and start a new build. You can see this little notification we got down here. We can directly click on that to open it up. Another really cool thing that you see here is it lists who made the last change and who made the last, or what the last commit is. And those are all hyperlinked, so they actually go to GitHub, so you can see what exactly was changed, which is really cool. Okay, so we're running our npm CI, so we're getting those dependencies. And npm CI, if you aren't familiar with it, works kind of like pulling an image from Docker. The first time you run it, it'll take a while to pull all of your dependencies, but then on subsequent runs, it'll only pull packages that need to have their version updated or that aren't present, which is really cool. While that's running, we'll go ahead and take a look at a couple of other things here. So you can see it automatically logs. If you click on this changes tab, it pulls in the commits that were done and who the author was, and the commit link itself, which will pull you over to GitHub, which is pretty neat. Okay, so we finally made it through installing our dependencies, and you can see it actually skipped right ahead 2 steps because the lint happened pretty quickly. So the thing that failed is npm run CI, which is basically my npm run test. But we can see we made it through 3 steps of our pipeline, or 3 stages of our pipeline just fine. Did npm audit, that had no issues. We installed our dependencies. That was fine. We linted our code. And there were some warnings, but no errors, so that passed. And we tried to run our tests, but failed. And the reason this failed is because it doesn't have any build files. So let's add one more step, or stage. Save it. Okay. Now we can come back to our pipeline over here. And we can just click our rerun. Another small thing to note here is this will obviously run faster or slower depending on the hardware that you have it running on or the hardware accessible to it in your VM. So in my case, the VM that it's running on isn't very powerful, which could be why npm dependencies took so long. We had another failure here, and I think that's because I did this incorrectly. I should have actually rebuilt the pipeline instead of replaying the particular build because that locks it at a specific commit. So that's my bad. So let's go back to our pipeline here, go to our branches, and we'll hit this play button instead of replay. And hopefully that takes into account some other things that we seemingly missed last time, like npm CI not seemingly pick up our existing packages. Finally got our build step. You'll notice our test didn't actually immediately fail this time, and that Cypress was finally able to actually pick up a spec and run the tests. Now hopefully future runs don't take as long. They shouldn't, now that we've had one clean build that actually made it all the way through. And we ended up passing, and you can even come back in here and look at these test results if you want. But that's not super useful for us. We would like to have some kind of reporting metric built into here. I believe this will just be empty at this point, yeah, because it doesn't know how to register them. So let's teach it how to understand those tests. Let's add one more stage. This is going to be outside of our stages. This is actually going to be called a post. Now, post lets you do things after the pipeline has completed, and that can be things like tagging or deploying, zipping up a bundle of assets, whatever you need it to do. And you can make it conditional, or in my case, I want it to be always. And Cypress by default has support for JUnit, as does Jenkins out of the box. So I'm just going to use that because it's already supported. So I'm going to say JUnit, and then in my case, my tests get created to this results folder, and they end in XML, which isn't my favorite format, but it's what JUnit uses. So we'll save that. We'll add that file back up to our repository. Push it up. And we'll come over here to our pipeline, go back to our branches and rebuild. Open that build up. Okay, so all of our tests passed, which means this is probably actually done now. It just hasn't quite refreshed yet. So if we refresh this page for it, we can see we now get a green banner at the top showing that it passed, and we can actually come over here to tests, and now we have recognition of all the tests that we ran. And as you add tests to your test suite, whatever reporting mechanism it uses, if it can output them, you can use this collection method to get those tests. Now, if you come over here to this artifact, you have a pipeline log, and we should also have our test files here, but they may not have shown up yet. And so something that's also cool is you can come over to the job itself in regular Jenkins, not in the blue. And what you can do here, we want to get out of this configuration. You can view the workspace that this project actually ran in. So we open up this development branch, open up the log. There's this workspaces folder. Open this up. In my case, my tests end up inside of Cypress, and they actually create a video file. So I can click on this and watch the results of all of my tests. Now, this is going to reveal that I need to do some CSS changes realistically, because I currently have this overflow and I don't have a test to capture that either. So that's something that I can add. But this visual is not something I would have gotten if the tests were just lost in a simple checkmark and checkbox. So that's just a kind of a cool feature that you can get back to these workspaces afterwards. Another configuration note here is that under this configuration, you can actually set it to limit the number of builds that it keeps. And that's really handy because you can get rid of old builds that you don't want to hold on to anymore. So that's all great, but I've triggered this manually every single time. How do we get it to automatically trigger? We created that GitHub token, right? It should be building for us. So let's go ahead and create a pull request and see if that does it for us. So first, let's go over to my project and let's make a change in something. We'll go to our pages. How about our index? And we'll just change our navigation component, and we'll change this to say dev blog. Save it, and we'll add that file. We'll create a new branch here. You can see I have other files that have been modified, but I did not add them to this change, so, or to this commit, so we shouldn't have them. So if I come over here and click, so if we open up GitHub here, now we want to make sure that we're targeting the right branch for our merge. Okay, let's create this PR. We have no conflicts. Let's go see if our Jenkins server has picked up this PR. Not yet, so we're missing something. Let's figure out what it is. Okay, so why aren't we getting our pull requests showing up here? Well, part of it may be that our token didn't have those correct permissions like I mentioned earlier. So let's go back over to our repository and let's go to settings and let's check and see if we have any webhooks. We don't, and that's a problem because Jenkins should have created them for us. So now we need to modify the Jenkins credentials so that it can actually automatically create that for us. So we'll head over to our Jenkins server, not in the blue interface, just on normal Jenkins. Over on the documentation for the GitHub plugin, we can see the steps that we need to do to configure this. So we need a OAuth token, which is what we were making before, but we didn't get the correct permissions. So we can go to Advanced Managed Additional GitHub Actions, convert login and password to token, and that's inside of our credentials in Jenkins. So let's do this. Let's go to Manage Jenkins. There we go. GitHub servers. We need to add one. Now we need credentials. There we go, they hit it. All right, from credentials. I don't want it globally, I want it under my user. Okay. Let's do this. Now, this may fail because I think I have two-factor authentication turned on for GitHub. So let's see. Let's refresh this. Okay, GitHub server. There we go, there's our token. Manage hooks. Do we need to do anything advanced here? No, I don't think so. Let's test this connection. Cool, save. Okay, so now this should work. And let's go to our configuration. try it. Do this scan and see what happens. Interesting. Did we get our webhooks added? Yes. So now we have our webhooks after enabling that scan and those credentials. Very interesting. So you can see now we have our button update branch building, as well as a re-index on development from that scan that we kicked off. And this PR is indexing. So I'm not convinced that this was because of our webhook, but we do have our webhook now. So let's go ahead and create another PR and see if that automatically kicks off. It should. Let's add the rest of these changes in here, because that's a bunch of linter fixes. And let's check out again. And we'll call this, yeah, we'll call it a patch. And we'll push this up and we'll see now if we get an automatic build once we create our PR. Okay, again, we want to target development. And let's hit create PR. Let's go take a look. Hey, we got our build automatically. Okay, that's going to be it for part 1. Part 2 is going to cover getting these status updates pushed back into PRs and then actually building those artifacts. So stay tuned for that. Should be coming in a couple of days. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day. Drop a comment if there's something else you would like to see me cover, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.